They took her baby while she was still healing from giving birth. No bruises, no broken bones, just a bump. The hospital called Child Protective Services, and within hours, her 6-week-old daughter was gone. They took her 6-week-old baby over a misdiagnosis. No tests, no second opinion, just a bump and a doctor's assumption. Within hours, Child Protective Services removed her daughter from her arms. Welcome back, and thank you for listening. I'm just a small storyteller, so if this touched you, please hit that subscribe button for more heartwarming stories like this. Let me know in the comments where and what time you're listening from. I read them all. Now let's hear the story. The evening started like any other. Tiana Rhodes had just finished feeding 6-week-old Nyla when she placed her on the changing mat. The soft lamp glowed in the corner of the nursery, casting golden light across the folds of blankets and the quiet corners of new motherhood. Malik was finishing dishes in the kitchen, humming the song they always used to settle Nyla down. As Tiana gently raised her baby's arm to unbutton the onesie, she paused. Nyla winced. It wasn't a cry, not even a whimper, just a sharp flinch, fast and barely there, but enough to freeze Tiana's hand midair. She leaned closer and ran her fingers slowly along Nyla's shoulder and upper chest. That's when she felt it, a small bump just above the collarbone. Firm, unmoving, no bruising, no discoloration. But every time her fingers brushed near it, Nyla squirmed in discomfort. Tiana called Malik immediately. He came fast, drying his hands on his shirt. She placed his hand where hers had been. You feel that? His brow furrowed. Yeah, what is that? She didn't have it yesterday. She's been fine. Maybe she bumped it. She can't even roll over. We carry her everywhere. There's no way. Tiana's voice was steady, but Malik could hear the edge under it. When it came to their daughter, she didn't panic, but she didn't take chances either. We should take her in, he said. I'm already grabbing the bag. They wrapped Nyla in her giraffe blanket and headed to the ER. It was late, just past 8 p.m., and the waiting room buzzed with fluorescent light and quiet urgency. The triage nurse brought them in within 20 minutes, faster than usual, which only made the knot in Tiana's chest tighter. A young resident doctor examined Nyla under the exam room's sterile glow. He pressed around the bump, glanced at her reaction, and asked a few standard questions. Any known allergies? Any recent falls? Anyone else watching the baby? Tiana answered each one evenly, though her hands wouldn't stop twitching in her lap. She's with me all day. She hasn't fallen. She's never left my sight. The doctor nodded without much comment, jotted something on his clipboard, and stepped out to consult a specialist. 20 minutes passed, then 40. A nurse poked in to say they were still waiting for word from the attending physician. By the time a woman entered, slacks, blazer, a laminated badge clipped to her belt, Tiana sat stiff as stone. Malik rose to his feet. The woman gave them a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good evening. I'm Carol. I'm with Child Protective Services. I was asked to step in. Tiana's heart dropped. Step in for what? There was a concern raised by the physician regarding Nyla's injury. Given the nature of it and the lack of clear explanation, we're initiating a temporary observation order. Malik narrowed his eyes. Hold on. What does that mean? Carol's tone was gentle, measured. It means she'll be placed in protective care for the night while we assess further. You'll receive follow-up instructions and a caseworker assignment within 48 hours. Tiana's voice cracked. You're taking her? This is just precautionary. It's for Nyla's safety. She is safe. With us. Carol gave a rehearsed nod. There's a process, Ms. Rhodes. Before Tiana could respond, a nurse entered the room with a clipboard and a rolling cart. On the cart sat a standard issue carrier. Tiana backed away, clutching Nyla tighter. You're not doing this. You haven't even done an x-ray. You don't know what it is. Carol stepped forward. Ma'am, please. If you resist, it could be documented as obstruction. She's my baby. I brought her here to make sure she was okay, not to lose her. Malik moved between them, hands raised, palms out. This is a mistake. The nurse moved silently, reaching out. Nyla didn't cry. That was the part that hollowed Tiana out from the inside. She didn't scream, didn't fuss. She just looked at her mother with big, quiet eyes, blinking slowly, as if she already knew silence was safer than sound. A few clicks, a signature, a clipboard passed, and then Nyla was wheeled away. The room fell still. The moment they walked out, Tiana collapsed onto the exam bed. Malik didn't move. He stood there, staring at the empty space his daughter had just occupied. They left the hospital with no answers, no instructions. Just a single sheet of discharge papers with nothing written under diagnosis and a generic number for CPS. At home, Tiana stood in the doorway of the nursery. She didn't go inside. The pink blanket on the crib, the half-folded onesie on the chair, the bottle warmer light still glowing faintly. It all felt like a crime scene. She sat in the rocking chair and stared at the floor. Malik sat on the carpet beside the door, his arms wrapped around his knees. No one said anything, because what was there to say when your baby is taken not with violence, but with silence? The apartment was too quiet. Tiana sat on the edge of the couch, staring at her phone like it owed her something. She had called the number on the discharge sheet 5 times. Left 2 voicemails. No one answered. No one called back. Malik had spent the morning printing every hospital receipt they had, every prenatal visit, every immunization record. He stacked them neatly on the kitchen counter like paperwork could prove they were good parents. They were told Nyla had only been placed under observation, that it was temporary, a word that sounded manageable, like a storm that might pass. But as the hours dragged into days and the silence from CPS grew heavier, Tiana started to feel like she was losing her daughter second by second. Their lawyer, a public defender named April, was kind but tired. She called them that Friday to give them a warning in the form of advice. Stay calm. Stay patient. Don't fight back. Don't give them a reason to label you combative, she said. The courts pay attention to that. Combative. The word stung. Tiana had already watched her baby get taken away without a single explanation. How could she not fight? That weekend was the first time Tiana didn't pump. Her body hurt, her chest ached, but her hands refused to reach for the bottle. What was the point? There was no baby to feed, no coups to answer, just an echo of what used to be. On Monday, April managed to push for supervised visitation. 1 hour. Neutral site. A state monitor would be present. Tiana showed up early, holding the small plush bunny she'd slept with for days. Malik came straight from work, his security guard uniform still on under his hoodie. The room was beige. Plastic chairs. A few scattered toys. A locked cabinet in the corner. When the door opened, Tiana stood so fast her chair fell backward. Nyla was in the arms of foster care worker, dressed in a yellow romper, her hair slightly longer, cheeks a little fuller. Tiana took a step forward. "Hi, baby girl," she whispered. Nyla didn't cry. She didn't reach. She just stared, confused, her gaze flickering between the 2 adults she used to know and the room she didn't. Tiana crouched down. "It's Mama. I missed you." Malik knelt too, shaking a rattle lightly. "Hey there, Pumpkin. You remember us." Nyla blinked. She clutched the soft bunny she was given in foster care and looked away. No smile, no giggle, just silence. Tiana tried to hold her, and the worker allowed it. But the baby didn't lean in. She sat stiff in her mother's arms, breathing fast. Tiana rocked her gently, whispered songs in her ear, but Nyla didn't relax. It was like holding a stranger. When the hour ended, the worker stood. "Time's up." Tiana hugged Nyla tighter, afraid to let go. Malik put a hand on her back. "We'll be back," he said. "You hear me? We'll be back real soon." Tiana handed her over. Her fingers didn't want to open. As the door closed, she felt something crack. Not loud, not visible, but deep, deep down. Outside in the car, Tiana didn't speak. Malik rested his head on the steering wheel for a full minute before starting the engine. Later that night, he worked a double. They needed money for legal fees, for filing paperwork, for whatever was next. Tiana stayed up printing photos from her phone, organizing medical forms, compiling prenatal visit logs. She created a binder labeled evidence. If CPS wanted proof of a safe home, she'd give them everything. But even then, the calls went unanswered. Every time Tiana called a caseworker, she got voicemail. When she called the CPS office directly, they told her to wait for her assigned rep. Wait. That word again. Like her baby wasn't growing older every day without her. April filed a request for more visitations. CPS pushed back, said depended on Nyla's emotional readiness. Tiana wanted to scream. Emotional readiness? They took her before she was old enough to recognize her own name. Malik came home later and later. He started sleeping on the couch, not out of distance, but exhaustion. His body ached. His paychecks vanished into gas, legal fees, and groceries they barely touched. Some nights, he'd stare at the wall for hours. I feel like I'm losing both of you, he said once, voice barely a whisper. Tiana kept working on the binder. She filled it with everything she could. Photos of Nyla's first bath, a screenshot of her prenatal vitamin schedule, the receipt for every doctor visit, even the pediatrician's comment at her 2-week checkup, healthy weight, strong neck. They didn't know what CPS wanted, so they gave them everything. The second supervised visit was worse than the first. Nyla cried when Tiana picked her up, cried like she didn't recognize the arms holding her. Malik tried to distract her with a toy, but the baby turned away. Tiana smiled through it, laughed gently, pretended it didn't hurt. But the moment she got home, she locked herself in the bathroom and screamed into a towel. That night, she stayed up again, searching, reading, finding cases online of other parents, other babies, stories that sounded too much like theirs. And still, no one returned her calls. The word temporary had started to rot. It wasn't temporary. It was systemic. It was cruel, and it was slowly killing them. The caseworker finally called on a rainy Wednesday morning. Tiana had nearly dropped her phone when she saw the number. Her hand shook as she swiped to answer. Ms. Rhodes, this is Denise from Child Protective Services. I wanted to provide an update. Tiana stood in the kitchen, barefoot, her coffee cold on the counter. Okay, please, what's happening? Following the hospital's report and the physician's concern, we're continuing the investigation under the presumption of suspected non-accidental trauma. Nyla will remain in temporary care while we gather additional information. Tiana's heart started pounding. I don't understand. What does that mean? What is suspected? What are you accusing us of? There is no formal accusation yet, the caseworker replied, her voice cold and mechanical. But given the nature of the injury, the child must remain out of home until safety can be established. You took her for a bump, Tiana said. You didn't even run tests. We follow medical recommendations, Ms. Rhodes. Then she ended the call. Tiana dropped the phone on the counter and sat down hard on the floor. She wasn't crying. She passed that phase. Now it just felt like sinking, like falling into a hole she couldn't see the bottom of. That night, she told Malik what was said. He didn't react the way she expected. No shouting, no pacing, just silence. He sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing the bridge of his nose, breathing slowly. They've already decided, he said. We haven't even had a proper hearing. They don't need one. All they need is a what if. Tiana didn't respond, because he was right, and that terrified her. He stayed up all night combing through his records. At dawn, he emailed April a scanned copy of a juvenile charge from when he was 16, a shoplifting incident he thought would never matter again. But now it might. They'll pull it, he said, even if it was 7 years ago, even if it has nothing to do with anything. They'll say you're dangerous. And you're hysterical, he added. That's the game. The next day, April called with news. The judge had reviewed the state's initial petition and granted CPS another 30 days to continue placement while the investigation proceeded. No mention of a formal charge. No effort to arrange reunification. Just more waiting. At the second supervised visit, Nyla was more distant than before. She didn't reach for them. She clung to the woman who brought her in, a foster care worker who smiled politely but didn't speak much. When Tiana lifted her daughter into her arms, Nyla cried and reached back toward the handler. The rejection was a knife. Tiana tried not to let it show. She smiled, rocked her, sang softly, pretended not to see the way the baby tensed in her arms. Malik sat beside her, trying to distract Nyla with a rattle. Nothing worked. The baby kept glancing at the door like she wanted to go home. Only it wasn't with them anymore. When the hour ended, Tiana handed her back. She didn't cry, didn't speak, but her eyes were glassy and her hands were trembling. In the parking lot, she sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. "She doesn't know me," she said softly. "She's confused. She cried when I picked her up. She didn't even want me to hold her. She's just overwhelmed." Tiana shook her head. "I'm her mother, Malik. And she didn't want me." That night, Malik worked overtime. They needed money, legal fees, gas, food, anything to keep them going. Tiana stayed home and began building what she called the war file. A binder with every photo of Nyla since birth. Screenshots of feeding logs. Texts to the pediatrician. Notes from WIC visits. Everything. She printed the hospital discharge report and highlighted the empty field next to imaging completed. No x-ray. No MRI. No ultrasound. They took her based on one touch. Tiana couldn't stop thinking about that. At the next visit, a state physician came to observe. He asked the foster worker if Nyla had been fussy or hard to carry. She mentioned that the baby flinched sometimes when lifted under the arms. The doctor made note. He examined Nyla gently, pressed along her collarbone, observed her face. Tiana watched his brow furrow. He said nothing to them, just took more notes and left. Later that week, April forwarded his update. The child displays tenderness at the collarbone and shoulder joints. Reaction may be behavioral or indicative of underlying musculoskeletal sensitivity. Cannot rule out residual injury. Tiana read it 3 times. Residual injury, she whispered. Residual from what? She stayed up that night, digging through medical blogs. She started with infant fractures, then joint pain, then bone disorders. That's when she stumbled on the phrase connective tissue disorder. One site led to another. She found an article titled, "When Fragility Looks Like Abuse, Misdiagnosed Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome in Children." Her hand started shaking. She clicked. A mother described how her newborn had been taken after doctors saw bruises and thought they were from grabbing too hard. The baby had cried when handled. But months later, genetic testing showed Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that made her skin bruise easily, her joints hyperflexible, and her bones unusually sensitive. Tiana kept reading. More stories, different states, similar timelines. She found forums, parents of kids with EDS, mothers, mostly black, mostly low income, describing how their children were taken, how CPS ignored symptoms, how they were treated like monsters. At 3 a.m., she opened a new tab and searched EDS symptoms in infants. Bone tenderness, delayed healing, skin hyperelasticity, fragile joints. Tiana stared at the list. Her mind raced. She thought about how Nyla winced when lifted, how the bump wasn't warm, wasn't bruised. Just there. She opened her phone and wrote a message to April. "I think we're looking in the wrong place. This could be a medical condition." She hesitated, then added, "I think they took my baby because she's sick, not because we hurt her." She didn't sleep. She just sat on the couch with the bunny Nyla used to sleep with, staring at the ceiling, letting that idea settle in her bones. If this was EDS, then Nyla had been in pain, and they'd taken her from the only people who ever held her gently. It took 3 more ignored voicemails and a missed visit for Tiana to reach her breaking point. She had been sitting in the kitchen, binder open, coffee gone cold again, when she saw another unavailable number call come and go. No voicemail, no follow-up, just silence. That was the day she realized she wasn't just up against confusion. She was up against a system that had decided who she was before they'd ever spoken to her. She pulled out the card a woman at the visitation center had slipped into her hand 2 weeks earlier. The woman wasn't an official, just a volunteer who handed out juice boxes and tried to distract kids with noisy toys. But she had leaned in, whispered, "You should talk to Dr. Ramirez. She actually listens." Tiana called the number that afternoon. The voice on the other end was soft but focused. Dr. Elena Ramirez, family pediatrician, community funded. No fancy receptionist, no cold waiting list. She had an opening the next day. Tiana explained everything in one breath. What the hospital said, what CPS said, what the visits felt like, what the bump was, the flinch, the fact that no one had ever run a scan. No x-ray, no ultrasound, just a judgment. Dr. Ramirez listened. Then she said, "Bring everything, every note, every picture, every paper you've got." Malik drove her the next morning. He hadn't spoken much lately. He was carrying the weight in silence, letting it press into his shoulders like a backpack full of concrete. They both walked into the clinic with manila folders, a binder full of photos, and 2 notebooks. Dr. Ramirez wasn't what they expected. She wore jeans and sneakers under her coat. Her curly hair was tied up in a scarf. She didn't type while they spoke. She just looked at them, her eyes locked in, like she saw people, not suspects. She took one look at the bump description and paused. Did anyone suggest genetic testing? Tiana blinked. No, they just said trauma. They assumed we hurt her. Ramirez nodded slowly. Does Nyla bruise easily? She hasn't had bruises. Just that flinch. And once her arms seemed stiff. Any history in your family of joint problems, fragile skin, hypermobility? I don't know. I wasn't raised around my biological family, Tiana said. I was in and out of care myself. Ramirez sat back. Has anyone mentioned Ehlers-Danlos syndrome? Tiana shook her head. It's a connective tissue disorder, she continued. It can make joints unstable, skin stretchy or fragile, bones prone to minor subluxations, partial dislocations that can mimic trauma. It's genetic, often missed in infants unless someone's looking for it. Malik leaned forward. You're saying this could explain everything? It could, Ramirez said. But we need tests. Genetic panels. Imaging to confirm joint laxity. Proper pediatric assessment. Tiana's heart started to race. Can you order that? I can request it, Ramirez said. But CPS has to approve access to medical testing since Nyla's under state custody. And I've seen how they respond. If they think the placement is safe, they rarely allow outside diagnostics. Ramirez wrote a letter anyway. She documented everything. Listed possible EDS, urged immediate testing. Sent it directly to CPS with medical justifications and the phrase time-sensitive highlighted in bold. A week passed. No response. Then 2. Tiana called the caseworker again. No answer. She called the CPS main line and asked for a status update. The clerk said the child was stable in care and medical requests were being reviewed. Stable. But she was a lab result. Like being stable was more important than being home. The next day, Ramirez called. They declined the request, she said. They said the current care team sees no cause for concern and there is no justification for reevaluation. Tiana didn't speak. Her ears rang. If you want testing, they said you're free to pursue it on your own through legal counsel, Ramirez added. In other words, they're not doing anything. I'm afraid not. Tiana hung up, shaking. That night, she sat on the floor of the nursery again. The room was quiet. She opened her laptop and searched EDS in infants. She found support groups, Reddit threads, Facebook forums, medical blogs. One thread caught her eye. It was titled, "They Took My Baby Because She Bruised." She read the whole thing. Then read another. And another. One mother was accused of grabbing her child too hard because of purple marks. Another said her son cried during diaper changes, and they called it behavioral signs of abuse. All had later received EDS diagnoses. All were poor. Most were young. Most were black. It was a pattern. They didn't see pain. They saw neglect. They didn't ask questions. They took. Tiana created an account on one of the forums and posted her story. Within an hour, 5 women responded. One said her daughter had the exact same bump. Another said CPS ignored her EDS diagnosis for 6 months. A third sent Tiana a list of clinics offering discounted genetic panels. Out of pocket, but possible. That same night, Malik got home early. Tiana showed him everything. The diagnosis, the posts, the doctor's refusal. He didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he opened the coffee jar on the counter and pulled out the envelope where they kept emergency cash. He held it up and said, "Let's do it. Even if it costs. I'll sell the car. Malik, I'll walk to work." She didn't argue. The next morning, they scheduled the test. Tiana didn't know what it would prove yet. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was finally stepping forward instead of begging. And even if no one else was listening, she'd make sure the truth got louder. The clinic was small, tucked between a laundromat and a discount shoe store in the west side of town. The paint was peeling. The chairs wobbled. But the testing lab in the back had what they needed, a pediatric genetic panel that could screen for connective tissue disorders, including Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It would cost $824, even with the community discount. It would take 3 weeks for results, and it was entirely out of pocket. Malik paid in cash. The envelope he had kept hidden behind the coffee jar wasn't enough, so he sold his car that week to make up the rest. He didn't tell Tiana until afterward. When she asked how they were going to get to their visitation center now, he just said, "I'll figure it out." And he did. 2 buses and a long walk in each direction. They didn't tell CPS. They didn't ask for permission. After being denied so many times, they knew better than to announce they were looking for the truth. Tiana mailed the saliva kit in herself. She triple-checked the barcode, sealed the box like it was something sacred, and whispered a prayer before dropping into the mailbox. Then they waited. Every day dragged like wet concrete. Visits with Nyla continued, but even those felt more like inspections than reunions. The CPS monitor kept notes. The foster care handler watched every interaction like it was an audition. And Nyla still looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure what was memory and what was dream. At the next visit, Tiana brought the stuffed bunny Nyla had loved as a newborn. It had stayed in the nursery the whole time. When she handed it to her daughter, Nyla sniffed it, turned it over in her fingers, then held it close. That tiny gesture broke Tiana in two. She smiled through the whole visit, but when they got back to the apartment, she fell apart. She cried until her chest hurt, and when Malik tried to hold her, she pushed him away, not because she was angry, but because everything in her felt fragile. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Nothing. Tiana called the lab. They said results had been sent out. April received them first. She called while Tiana was folding laundry, her hands full of onesies that hadn't been worn in months. "We have it," she said. "It's positive." Tiana dropped the clothes. "What?" "Nyla has classical EDS, type 3. It's genetic, confirmed through both markers and family history indicators. She didn't have an injury. She has a condition." Tiana couldn't speak. She lowered herself to the floor, slowly. Phone pressed to her ear like it was a lifeline. "This means we can move," April said. "We're filing a motion to dismiss the neglect assumption and request reunification under medical error." "Does this mean we get her back?" "It means they have to answer now. Really answer." Malik got home to find Tiana sitting on the living room floor, the test results printed and clutched to her chest. He sat beside her, and for a long time, they didn't speak. They just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, holding a truth no one could ignore anymore. The motion was filed within 2 days. April attached the lab results, Dr. Ramirez's initial suspicion, Tiana's full prenatal and pediatric record, and copies of every medical denial CPS had issued. The motion argued not just for error, but for systemic negligence, that the agency had ignored clear signs of a genetic disorder and prolonged the separation without cause. They expected a hearing date. Instead, they got resistance. CPS responded with a statement that the diagnosis did not eliminate the possibility of harm and that further evaluation was needed before considering placement change. The phrase they used was "the environment remains under review." Then the news came that shattered whatever breath they'd just begun to take. The foster family had filed a petition to adopt Nyla. Tiana found out through a third-party legal notice. She stared at the envelope on her kitchen table and read it 5 times. Then she threw it across the room. "They're trying to take her forever," she said. "They're really doing it." Malik didn't speak. He went into the bedroom and shut the door. Tiana opened her laptop. She reopened the support group threads. She reread her post. Then she started typing again. This time, she didn't hold anything back. She titled the new post, "They took my baby while I was still healing." She told the whole story. The ER visit, the bump, the lack of x-rays, the cold CPS call, the denied tests, the diagnosis they paid for themselves, the visits, the silence, the feeling of being invisible while her daughter lived in someone else's home. She posted a photo of Nyla's bunny, one from the nursery, one of Malik holding their baby in the hospital. She blurred the baby's face, left everything else raw. Within 12 hours, the post had over 1,000 shares. By the next day, a journalist from a small independent outlet messaged her. "Can we talk?" Tiana said yes. The article went live the next week. It included quotes from Dr. Ramirez, the timeline, even an excerpt from the medical report. It ended with a photo of the empty nursery and a headline that read, "They said abuse." It was a rare disorder. Within days, the story started trending. People began asking questions. How many other children were taken without testing? How many diagnoses were missed? Why didn't CPS respond? That pressure did something. It cracked the silence. April received a call from the district attorney's office requesting a formal meeting. A hearing date was finally scheduled, but the damage had already been done. Tiana stood in Nyla's room and looked around. Everything was still where she left it, waiting, but she was different now. The woman who used to rock her daughter to sleep had been broken and rebuilt, and the new version of her was not quiet. They tried to erase her. Now she was writing everything down. For the record, for the truth, for the daughter who was never supposed to be taken. The hearing was set for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 6:15, Tiana was already up, pacing in the living room, dressed in the same slate gray blouse she'd worn the day she first saw Nyla in the visitation center. She stood in front of the mirror, buttoning it slowly, carefully. It still smelled like the drawer it came from, but to her it smelled like war. She wanted the court to see someone composed, someone prepared, someone who had waited 478 days and had every single one of them etched into her bones. Malik sat at the kitchen table, silent, spoon in a bowl of cereal he hadn't touched. He was wearing his only suit, the collar a bit snug at the neck. His jaw had grown sharper in the last year. So had his eyes. They looked older now, colder, less hopeful. But when he glanced at Tiana, he nodded once. Just once. That was enough. April met them outside the courthouse. She looked more energized than usual, a binder under her arm, her phone already buzzing with messages from local reporters. Since the article went viral, Tiana's inbox had flooded with stories from other mothers, some from across the country. Women who'd lost children over bruises that turned out to be birthmarks, over bumps that turned out to be calcium deposits, over silence that wasn't safety, but pain. They entered the courtroom at 9:52. There were more people than expected. A few journalists in the back. A woman from the local parent advocate group. Even Dr. Ramirez sat quietly in the second row, hands folded in her lap. Tiana caught her eye. Ramirez gave her the smallest nod, one that said, "You're not alone." The judge entered promptly. She was older, stern-looking, with gray hair pulled into a bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose. She asked everyone to remain seated unless called upon. Then she turned to the CPS attorney and asked for a status summary. The attorney, a young man in a sleek navy suit, stood and began reading from a statement. He acknowledged the medical findings, but insisted the agency acted in good faith based on the information available at the time. He said the foster family had provided a stable, loving home, and that removing Nyla again could cause emotional disruption. He emphasized the need for slow, deliberate reintegration, if reunification were even appropriate. April stood. Her voice was low, calm, but cut through the room like a scalpel. She walked through every denial CPS had made. She listed every visit missed because Tiana and Malik couldn't get a response. She quoted the medical report line by line. She handed the judge a printed copy of the adoption petition the foster family had filed just weeks after the genetic diagnosis came in. She paused for a moment. Then she said, "This isn't just a case of misunderstanding. This is what happens when a system punishes poverty, filters every loving parent through a lens of suspicion, and values bureaucracy over biology. This child was taken, then forgotten, and it is only by the sheer force of her mother's will that we are even standing here today." The courtroom went still. The judge turned to CPS. Was there a formal reevaluation after the diagnosis? "No, Your Honor," the attorney admitted. "Was there a second medical opinion sought?" "No, Your Honor." And yet the agency continued with the foster placement and did not notify the parents of their right to contest. "Yes, Your Honor. That is correct." Tiana could feel her fingers digging into the bench. She hadn't realized how hard she was gripping until she saw her knuckles turning white. Malik sat beside her, body motionless, but his foot tapped out a rhythm against the floor. His anxiety always showed in movement. April handed the judge one final document, the lab receipt. It was the original payment invoice for the genetic testing, with Malik's name handwritten on the top. They paid for the truth themselves, Your Honor. They had to, because no one else would. The judge was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. The court finds that the original grounds for removal were insufficiently supported, and that failure to investigate alternative medical explanations constitutes negligence by the investigating agency. The child's continued placement outside of the biological home is no longer justified. Tiana felt the words hit her like rain after a drought. The judge continued, I am ordering immediate reunification. Transitional visitation begins within 48 hours. Full custody to be restored within 2 weeks, pending final home inspection, which this court expects CPS to expedite. She paused, looked at Tiana, looked at Malik. I understand this does not undo the time lost, but I hope it begins to repair what should never have been broken. Tiana couldn't breathe. Malik grabbed her hand so tightly she thought her fingers might bruise. But she didn't pull away. Outside, the reporters swarmed. April handled most of it. Tiana answered one question. What do you want people to know? She looked straight at the camera. But they didn't save her. They just took her. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Her tears were dried up somewhere between day 60 and day 140. The first transition visit happened that Friday. Tiana stood at the park where they'd agreed to meet. It was spring now. Flowers blooming around concrete benches. She wore the same shirt she wore to the ER the night Nyla was taken, as if time could circle back and start over. When the car pulled up, Tiana didn't move. She watched the door open, the handler step out, then that tiny body, stronger now, walking without help, appear beside her. Nyla looked around. Then she saw her. There was a long second where no one moved. Then Nyla took 3 slow steps forward. 4, 5. Tiana knelt. Nyla stopped just short of her knees. And then she reached. Arms up. Mama. One word. Soft. Barely audible. But it was enough to shatter the world and build it again. Tiana pulled her close, held her so tight the handler had to look away. Malik was crying now, tears silent, but steady, arms wrapped around both of them like he'd never let go again. It wasn't over, but it had begun. The hallway outside the courtroom felt heavier than the room itself. Tiana stood near the window, watching traffic below move like nothing in the world had changed, even though everything in hers had. Malik was beside her, suit jacket draped over one arm, tapping his fingers against his leg like he had for every hearing before this. But today was different. Today wasn't about delay or denial. Today was the hearing that would decide if their daughter finally came home for good. It had been 12 days since the judge ordered transition visitation. 12 days of reintroducing themselves to a child who now blinked at them like they were halfway between strangers and memories. Nyla had laughed for the first time on day 4, said to on day 7, fell asleep on Tiana's chest by day 10. And yet, with every smile came a flicker of fear that it could be taken back. Inside the courtroom, April was already seated. She'd been tireless since the motion passed, coordinating inspections, emailing updates, pushing CPS to meet every deadline without excuse. She greeted them both with a nod that was firm but unreadable. Tiana had learned not to take that personally. April didn't show hope unless she knew it was earned. CPS arrived late. Their attorney entered alone, no caseworker in sight. He shuffled papers and avoided looking in their direction. Tiana noticed it. Malik noticed it. So did April. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. She reviewed the prior findings first. Medical misdiagnosis confirmed. Parental compliance with court orders confirmed. No further concerns from the reunification monitors. She summarized the transition report, which described the visits as positive and appropriately bonded. The home inspection passed without reservation. Then she folded her hands and asked the CPS attorney, "Is there any objection to reunification?" He cleared his throat. The agency still has some reservations regarding the long-term adjustment of the child in the biological home. April stood immediately. Respectfully, Your Honor, those concerns are neither medically nor legally substantiated. The agency has failed to provide documentation supporting continued separation. The judge raised a hand. I've read the report. The child is bonded. The home is safe. The diagnosis is documented. I see no reason to delay further. Tiana held her breath. I am ordering full physical and legal custody of Nyla Rhodes to be returned to her biological parents, effective immediately. The state is to update all custodial records within 72 hours and facilitate any remaining paperwork required for transfer of care. The words didn't land like thunder. They landed like peace, like something soft unfolding after a long, bruising silence. Tiana's breath hitched. Malik's shoulders dropped like a weight had slid off his spine. April smiled, but only slightly. Even Victory felt cautious in a room like this. When they stepped outside, the sunlight hit them in a way it hadn't for months. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. Tiana just pulled out her phone and sent one message to Dr. Ramirez. It's done. They picked up Nyla later that afternoon. The foster family didn't say much. The handler handed over the baby with a clipboard and a quick explanation of her feeding times. Nyla clung to the stuffed bunny Tiana had brought on every visit. She was quiet, alert. She nestled into Malik's arms like she was trying to remember something she used to know. When they brought her home, Tiana walked her through every room like she was giving a tour. The nursery looked exactly as it had when she left. Nothing had been touched, not because they forgot, but because they hadn't been able to move anything. The crib still held the same sheets. The books were stacked by color. The mobile above the crib still played the same lullaby. Nyla looked around like it was familiar, and yet not. She reached for the mobile. When played its soft, slow tune, she smiled. That night, Tiana rocked her for hours. She didn't sing. She didn't need to. The room was quiet except for the creak of the chair and the soft rhythm of Nyla's breathing. Malik stood in the doorway, watching them. He didn't interrupt. He just watched the woman he loved holding the daughter they almost lost. Later, while Nyla slept in her crib for the first time in nearly a year and a half, Malik and Tiana sat on the couch in the dark. They didn't turn on the TV. They didn't open their phones. They just sat. Their hands touched, fingers barely entwined, like they were reminding each other they were still real. Tiana whispered, I thought she wouldn't remember us. Malik replied, she didn't forget. She just had to find us again. The next day, a follow-up call came from CPS. A final closure document would be mailed. Tiana didn't ask for a copy. She had every date memorized already. What she didn't have were the words she really wanted, an apology and acknowledgement. But she knew she wouldn't get that. Instead, she focused on something else. She started keeping a journal. Not of what happened before, but what came after. Nyla's first night back. Her first full meal at home. Her first real laugh. Her first word since reunification, Bunny. Tiana began to write down everything. And slowly, it began to sound less like grief and more like recovery. April sent a message a week later. A journalist had asked to do a follow-up. National coverage this time. Tiana declined. She didn't want another article. She didn't want more attention. What she wanted was to be a mother. In peace. But she agreed to one thing. She let April send the medical file to a non-profit tracking wrongful CPS removals. Not to seek damages, but so that Nyla's name, redacted, protected, could become part of a larger story. One that might keep someone else from being erased. On the 14th night, Tiana stood by Nyla's crib as her daughter slept, one hand resting on the wooden rail. She looked at the soft rise and fall of her chest, the relaxed fingers clutching her bunny, the absolute peace of a child who no longer had to wonder where home was. Tiana didn't move for a long time. She just stood there, memorizing everything. The curve of her cheek, the quiet hum of the mobile, the way the air in the room finally felt whole. It wasn't justice, but it was theirs. Tiana no longer woke up to the sound of silence. Not the kind that echoed through the apartment during those first nights without Nyla. Not the kind that made her chest feel hollow and the crib look like a casket for dreams. Now, she woke to the shuffle of tiny feet against hardwood floors, the whisper of toy wheels dragging across the rug, and the sweet, sleepy call of Mama from the nursery doorway. It had been 4 months since the final hearing. For months since the judge signed the order that returned legal and physical custody of Nyla to the only parents she had ever known. And yet, not a day passed where Tiana didn't think of everything they lost, everything they clawed back, and everything they still didn't have words for. Some days were harder than others. There were still nightmares. Nyla sometimes cried out in her sleep and didn't know why. She'd wake up and cling to Tiana like something was chasing her through dreams she couldn't explain. On those nights, Tiana would hold her close, whisper that she was safe, that Mama and Daddy were here, and she would rock her back to sleep in the same chair that had sat untouched for nearly a year and a half. The nursery had changed since then. Not completely, but enough. The books had been replaced with newer ones, many of them about strong girls and soft animals and big feelings. The crib had become a toddler bed. The mobile still played its tune, but now Nyla pressed the button herself, proud of her independence, grinning every time it spun. Malik had returned to work full-time. He got a job with better hours and better benefits. It wasn't glamorous, but it let him come home in time for dinner. He'd walk through the door and drop to his knees so Nyla could run in his arms. That moment became their ritual, one Tiana never interrupted. She just watched from the kitchen, heart full, throat tight, memorizing the sound of her family healing. Tiana never went back to her old job. She couldn't. Not after everything. Instead, she started working part-time for a local parent advocacy group. It began with 1 meeting, then 2, then a volunteer shift, and finally a job offer. Her role was simple but important: intake coordinator for mothers seeking help navigating CPS. She didn't tell them her story unless they asked. Most didn't. They had their own pain, their own paper trails, their own courts to survive. But when they looked at her and asked, "Will I get them back?" she always looked them in the eye and said, "You fight like hell. And don't stop until you do." Dr. Ramirez still checked in every few weeks. She remained Nyla's primary pediatrician, now with a detailed note at the top of her chart. Diagnosed genetic disorder, classical EDS, not indicative of trauma. It was the kind of sentence that should have been there from the start. It now stood like a shield, guarding Nyla from ever being misunderstood again. The journal Tiana had started in the early days of reunification grew thicker by the week. She filled it with photos, scribbles, and stories. The day Nyla fed herself applesauce. The first time she said bunny and meant it. The day she reached out during a storm and whispered, "Mama, stay." These are not just moments. They were proof of survival, of love, of a bond that had been stretched but never broken. Sometimes when Nyla was napping, Tiana would sit by the window with that journal open and read it like scripture. Not because she needed to remember, but because she needed to remind herself it was real. That they had made it through. That even though the state had tried to erase them, their love had written itself back into permanence. One Friday morning, she received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo of Nyla taken during her time in foster care. It had been printed on plain paper, folded neatly, and tucked between 2 blank sheets. No note, no explanation, just a reminder. Tiana stared at it for a long time. Nyla looked healthy in the photo, cared for. But her eyes were vacant, uncertain, not the eyes of a child who knew where she belonged. Tiana placed the photo in the back of the journal, not out of hatred, but to honor the whole story. The part no one liked to talk about. The part where safe didn't mean home. As fall approached, the leaves turned copper and gold outside their apartment window. Nyla loved collecting them. Every day after daycare, she and Malik would walk to the park and gather leaves like they were treasure. They brought them home in sandwich bags and lined them up along the windowsill. Tiana didn't have the heart to throw them away. One day, while Nyla was napping, Malik came into the kitchen holding a flyer. "It's a summit," he said. "Advocacy and policy reform. They're asking parents who've gone through it to speak. You think we should go?" Tiana looked at the flyer. A panel. A microphone. A stage. "I'm not sure," she said. "We don't have to tell them everything. Just the parts that matter." She looked down the hallway, toward the closed nursery door. She thought of how small Nyla had been the last time they'd held her in a hospital. She thought of a nurse wheeling her away. Of Carol from CPS and her laminated badge. of silence stretching across every phone line they dialed. And she thought of now, of leaves on the windowsill, of lullabies played by chubby fingers, of laughter finally echoing in their home. Maybe, she said, not now, but maybe. That night, as they lay in bed, Malik pulled her close. You still don't sleep well, he said quietly. I don't think I ever will. But you still dream? She paused, then nodded. I do now. Across the hallway, Nyla turned in her sleep, Bunny tucked beneath her arm. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch. She just sighed softly and settled deeper into the safety she'd fought to find her way back to. It wasn't a perfect ending. Nothing tied up in a neat bow. There was no courtroom apology, no public statement from the agency, no reversal of the months they'd lost. But Tiana didn't need perfect. She had something better. She had her daughter, her name written back on the birth certificate, her laughter stitched back into the walls of their home, her little voice calling Mama in the morning light. She had what the system tried to take, and she wasn't letting go.